Bible tells us Jesus literally and physically rose from the dead. But how can we be certain we can trust the Bible's testimony? I'm Jean Wilund, and we're going to tackle this question in today's episode of It's All About Him. Did you know there are about 25,000 manuscript copies of portions of the New Testament? 25,000 copies. This stands above all other ancient documents as the most duplicated and preserved in history. The next most copied ancient document is Homer's Iliad, and only 643 copies of the Iliad exist. So around 25,000 copies of eyewitness accounts of the risen Christ support that Jesus rose from the dead and that we can trust the New Testament records. In the year 64, the Roman historian Tacitus, he wrote about Jesus and his resurrection. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote around 93 to 94 AD about Jesus of Nazareth and his resurrection on the third day. Even those who denied Christ's resurrection, they didn't deny his existence, or that he performed miracles, or that he died on the cross and was buried. These are undisputed facts. But what about his resurrection? How can we be certain it happened? In my video, Does It Matter If Jesus Rose from the Dead? We see that Christianity rises or falls depending on the resurrection. Let's be certain that Jesus really did rise from the dead. The mountain of written evidence from the eyewitness accounts should be enough for us. And I'll put some links to some of the articles that detail some of the archaeological evidence. I'll put it in the description. But in this video, I really just want to focus on the support we have of the logic and reason based in Scripture alone. So first of all, let's just settle in our hearts and our minds that nothing is impossible for God. The resurrection of Jesus was easy for him. Now let's look at the facts of Jesus' resurrection in Scripture and let's reason together. For much of Jesus' 3-year public ministry, he made more friends than he did enemies for much of it. However, by the end of his ministry, the scales had tilted. His enemies far outweighed his friends and left him with really only a small, faithful group of men and women. The leaders picked up stones to kill him because he claimed to be God. When Jesus said, "I and the Father are one, and I tell you the truth, before Abraham was born, I am," they knew he was declaring to be the one true God who existed eternally long before Abraham ever fathered the Jewish nation. Claiming to be God was the highest crime you could commit. The Jews wouldn't even, it still is the highest crime you can commit. The Jews wouldn't even speak God's name out loud, except when reading the Torah or in prayers. And they didn't dare write his name out. So when Jesus claimed to be God, his words, his claim infuriated the Jewish leaders, enraged them. Their hatred of him flamed into an unquenchable inferno. The Jewish leaders hated Jesus for claiming to be God, but they also hated him for threatening their power. At one point, many of Jesus' followers wanted to make him their king. Well, this threatened not only the Jewish leaders' power among the Israelites, but it also threatened their peace with Rome, the country they served. If Caesar suspected mutiny was rising up in Israel, his heavy hand would clamp down on Jerusalem, and the Jewish leaders' nearly autonomous rule would evaporate. The threat of losing their power did what nothing else could do. It brought the two competing groups of Jews together, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. They they agreed about Jesus, he had to go, and he had to stay gone. As motivated as they were to kill Jesus, they were even more motivated that he stay dead. Keeping corpses dead is rarely a concern for executioners, but Jesus was hardly your typical target. So they took unusual precautions to keep Jesus in the grave. They could not let him rise from the dead as he promised he would, because that would confirm his claims to be God and indict them for having murdered God's Son. No, Jesus must not be allowed to rise again. So let's read about this from Matthew 27. Now on the next day, the day after the preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I am to rise again.' Therefore, give orders for the grave to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal him away and say to the people, 'He has risen from the dead.' And the last deception will be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard. Go, make it as secure as you know how." And they went and made the grave secure, and along with the guard, they set a seal on the stone. The seal was a soft, moldable substance, maybe clay, with the Roman imperial seal stamped into it and attached to the stone with a rope. All of Rome's power and authority stood behind the seal. If you broke the seal, Rome would break you with a horrible death. But first, you had to get past their guards. These guards followed strict rules with severe consequences if they broke the rules. They couldn't sit down or lean against anything while they were on duty. Commentators say that if a guard fell asleep, he was beaten and burned with his own clothes. One commentator I read said that the entire 16-man unit was burned, not just the sleeping guard. Motivation. Whether they were all burned or one burned, that's motivation. No way they were letting Jesus rise again on their watch. Except he did. Knowing all of this background that I've been telling you before the resurrection happened helps us understand the significance of the religious leaders and other people's actions after the resurrection. That helps confirm the validity of the reports on the resurrection. When eyewitness reports of Jesus' resurrection surfaced and spread, his enemies set out to shut the reports down. They had one sure way: bring out Jesus' dead body, display it for the world to see. With all they had to lose if Jesus rose from the dead, it is reasonable to assume that they would have used every single resource available to them to find Jesus' body and parade it down Jerusalem's Via Dolorosa. They would have loved to have chiseled it into stone for all eternity to know Jesus is still dead. Bringing out Jesus' dead body would have just dismantled Christianity before it even started. Jesus' followers, they'd already scattered. They weren't gathered together and building Christ's church. They weren't forming an uprising. They were hiding in fear and preparing to return to their old lives, fully defeated. If the Jewish leaders had simply presented Jesus' dead body, Christianity would be dead, and Jesus would have been a joke. But this is what happened instead. Let's look at Matthew 28. Now after the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the grave. And behold, a severe earthquake had occurred, for an angel of the Lord descended from the heaven, and came and rolled away the stone and sat upon it. And his appearance was like lightning, and his clothing as white as snow. The guards shook for fear of him and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who has been crucified. He is not here, for he has risen just as he said. Come, see the place where he was lying. Go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead, and behold, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Behold, I have told you." Now let's jump on to verse 11. Now while they were on their way, some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priests all that had happened. And when they had assembled with the elders and consulted together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers and said, "You are to say, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this should come to the governor's ears, we will win him over and keep you out of trouble." And they took the money, and they did as they had been instructed. And this story was widely spread among the Jews, and is to this day. The religious leaders apparently expected everyone to believe that the small handful of disciples who scattered in fear when Jesus was arrested, suddenly came together with newfound bravery after his gruesome crucifixion. And without anyone seeing, they stole his body. What would it take to pull off a heist like that? Well, first, these well-trained guards, who knew their very lives would be forfeited in an unpleasant manner by their superiors if they fell asleep on the job, they would have to allow themselves to fall asleep. All of them. But for the sake of argument, let's suppose the guards did indeed fall asleep. We are expected to believe that this timid group of fishermen, tax collector, and other non-soldierly types approached undetected in the quiet stillness of the night. They unsealed the tomb, shoved the heavy stone aside without making a sound, took the time to remove Jesus' grave clothes and to neatly fold the cloth that covered his face and leave them neatly in the tomb. And then they hauled Jesus' dead and I guess now naked body away without the guards waking up. Again, for the sake of argument, let's suppose the disciples actually did all this. How could the guards know it was the disciples who stole the body? They were asleep, right? I mean, did they leave a calling card? I guess the Jewish leaders went with the sleeping guards lie because it was just too much to ask anyone to believe the disciples out-muscled the guards. And I guess they hoped that no one would pick up on the whole "can't see anything while you're asleep" challenge to their hastily crafted lie. And then there's the challenge of the disciples needing to successfully and quickly hide Jesus' body for all time. They didn't have Siri to ask for any suggestions. Hey Siri, where can we hide a body? For the sake of argument, let's assume the disciples did pull off this miraculous heist and brilliantly hid his body. Are we also expected to believe that these master criminals chose then to remain in Jerusalem, the scene of their crime, and to preach a resurrected Christ to the very same audience that had cried out for his crucifixion, rather than go off to another place far away and start over, or stay there but live their lives in peace? And again, where could the disciples hide the body so quickly? Not to be too graphic, but decomposing bodies are hard to hide after the smell kicks in. They'd have had to stash his body in the perfect spot so that all of Jerusalem, or at least the area around them, wouldn't find it or smell it. Remember, these were poor men who weren't expecting Jesus to die. They thought he was coming to set them free from Rome, not to die at their hands. They didn't have time to hash out an elaborate plan, by the way, which required the guards to sleep That's your plan, is the guards that refuse to sleep will sleep? And they didn't have money to bribe the guards because Judas Iscariot was in charge of the money, and he was gone. So the lie just falls apart at every seam. But for the sake of argument, let's assume that the disciples pulled off this heist and successfully hid the body and lied about it. What chance is there that they could have successfully pulled the long con and lied about the resurrection for the rest of their lives and convince over 500 other people to also lie for the rest of their lives by claiming that they too saw the resurrected Christ? It wasn't just the disciples who saw them. He presented himself to over 500 people. These 500 people and disciples would either have to be delusional or amazing liars. Now, what is the chance that over 500 people are going to be suddenly, instantly delusional about the exact same thing? Thus, we would have to accept that they all lied and were keeping their stories straight and carried their lie to the grave. Isn't it reasonable to assume at least one of the disciples or one of the 500 would have finally caved in and admitted the disciples stole and hid Jesus' body? And what would they even gain from it all? What are they gaining from saying that he rose from the dead? The opportunity to be persecuted and martyred? It's simply not reasonable. They were not getting healthy and wealthy. Now, let's look back at the religious leaders and what they did and didn't do after the resurrection. That is so telling. The leaders never denied the tomb was empty. They admitted it, but they also never tried to present Jesus' body. There's no record of them even trying to find his body. Why? After Christ was born, King Herod was so threatened by the rumor of the birth of a new king that he scoured the land in search of baby Jesus. Herod sent his soldiers to search out and kill every baby boy in Bethlehem who was 2 years old or younger. He didn't want his rule threatened. If the Jewish leaders really believed the disciples stole Jesus' body, and we know that they were terrified that their power would be threatened, why is there zero record of them scouring the land to find Jesus' body? They claimed the disciples stole it, but there's not even a record of the Jewish leaders bringing these so-called thieving disciples in for questioning. Remember the severe penalty for breaking the seal of the tomb? Well, apparently nobody cared anymore about the disciples breaking the seal, the Roman seal, and stealing Jesus' body. They weren't arrested despite the leaders and the bribed guards' accusations against them of committing a high crime against Rome. The leaders desperately needed to find Jesus' body. It was the key. It was the sure way to stop the spread of Christianity that they so desperately and vehemently hated. There's not even a record of them trying, just their flimsy lie. Are we really supposed to believe that Jesus' enemies could have proved he didn't rise from the dead, but just chose not to do it? That all they chose to do was craft a weak lie and hope nobody notices the massive holes in the lie? No body, no crime. Okay, well, there was a body, but it was not a dead body. It was a risen body. He is risen. He is risen indeed. Now, let's look at the dramatic change that came over Jesus' disciples after Pentecost. They went from being fearful to faithful. Each one of them transformed from a cowering handful of men hiding behind a locked door into a bold band of brothers dedicated to spending their lives spreading the message of the gospel of a risen Savior. Would they really do it simply for the sake of maintaining a lie? This claim of his resurrection brought them persecution and death, not health or wealth. Jesus' own brothers, his biological brothers, didn't even believe in him before the crucifixion. But after he rose from the dead, they did. Why would they suddenly devote their lives to worshiping their brother, who they refused to worship before he died, when he was doing amazing miracles? They didn't believe in him then, but after he rose from the dead, they believed. His resurrection removed all of their doubts that he was their Lord and their God. If you're still not sure if you believe in the resurrection of Christ, I encourage you to study it. Study the scriptures. Look at the mountain of evidence, because everything rises and falls on the resurrection. The resurrection demands a response. Christ demands a response. I pray you will just let go of your unbelief and surrender to him, our risen Lord, because truly, truly, your eternal soul depends on it. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? He is risen. He is risen indeed. I hope you found this video helpful, and if you did, share it with a friend and subscribe to my channel. Click on the bell and you will get notified whenever I post something new, and go to my website and subscribe there as well. And above all, remember, it's all about him.